The battlefield still smelled like fire and metal. Burnt machines littered the ground, and the last of the alien raiders had either fled or been destroyed. Mason stood in the middle of the ruined outpost, his armor scratched and stained. He had fought for 6 hours straight with no backup, no sleep, and almost no ammo left. But he had done what others couldn't. He saved the entire station alone, the alien commander of the outpost. A thick-scaled brute named Exaron walked up to him. "You fight like a wild beast, human," Exaron said, with a deep voice. "You've earned a reward." Mason didn't care for rewards. He wanted a warm shower, a quiet room, maybe a strong drink. Instead, they brought something else. Chains clanked on the floor as 2 guards dragged someone forward. It was a girl, no, a young alien woman. Her wrists chained, her feet bruised, her skin pale under layers of dirt. She didn't lift her head, didn't speak. Her clothes were torn rags, and a fresh bruise bloomed across her cheek. She was shaking, but not from cold. It was fear deep. In raw, "This is Sale," Exaron said, like he was giving away an old tool. She was taken from one of the captured ships, unused, but uncooperative. Mason's eyes narrowed. "She's not a thing," he said quietly. "Why are you giving her to me?" Exaron laughed. "You saved our lives, soldier. Take her, do whatever you want, she's yours." Mason didn't speak, but his jaw clenched. This wasn't a reward, it was a curse. He looked down at the girl who still refused to meet his eyes. She whispered something so soft it was almost missed. "Please, just kill me." Mason's heart twisted at those words. He had seen prisoners before, seen broken soldiers, but never someone this hollow. She wasn't trying to escape, wasn't crying, wasn't even begging. She had already given up. He stepped forward slowly, kneeling beside her. "What's your name?" he asked. She hesitated, then answered with a voice like dust and ash. "Sale." "All right, Sale," Mason said. "You're coming with me?" The guards moved to hand him the chain, but he raised his hand to stop them. "Take it off," he ordered. Exaron looked confused. "She might run. She won't," Mason said, staring straight at the girl, "because I won't treat her like an animal." The guards hesitated, but one unhooked the chain from her wrists. Sale flinched, but didn't move. Mason offered his hand to her, but she didn't take it. So he simply walked ahead, turning once to say, "You can walk if you want." She followed, silent and slow. They reached Mason's small quarters, just a temporary room for soldiers. He opened the door and stepped inside. Wasn't much: one bed, one table, a basic heater, and an old first aid kit on the shelf. Sale stood at the doorway like a ghost, unsure if it belonged in the living world. "You can come in," Mason said gently. She stepped inside but stayed near the door, eyes watching everything, especially him. He took off his armor piece by piece, each clink loud in the quiet room. Then he pointed to the food pack on the table. "It's not great, but it's hot." Sale didn't move. Mason didn't push her. Instead, he sat on the floor, far from the bed, and leaned against the wall. "I'm not going to hurt you," he said. "You're not mine. No one owns you not anymore." She didn't answer, but she sat, curled in the corner like a frightened animal. That night, Mason didn't sleep much. He kept one eye open, not because he feared her, but because he feared for her. Just past midnight, he heard movement. He turned his head and saw her standing over the table, holding something, one of his tools, sharp and small, but it wasn't aimed at him. She had pressed it against her own throat. "I won't go through it again," she said quietly, tears on her cheeks. "I'd rather end it now." Mason stood up fast, hands raised, voice low but firm. "Don't do it," he said. "Please, Sale. Not here. Not tonight." She shook, but didn't press harder. "You don't know what they did to me," she whispered. "You don't know what I've seen." "I don't," Mason agreed. "But I know one thing: if you end your life now, they win again." He stepped closer, slowly. "I'm not them, Sale, and I swear." "You're safe here." She stared at him, eyes filled with pain and confusion. Then she dropped the tool and collapsed to her knees, sobbing silently. Mason rushed forward and caught her gently before she hit the floor. That night she cried herself to sleep in his arms, not as a slave, not as property, but as someone who, maybe for the first time, was being treated like a person. And that was the moment Mason knew this reward was not a gift from the aliens. It was a test from the universe, and he would not fail it. The room was quiet, except for the soft hum of the heater. Mason stayed awake on the cold floor, while Sale lay curled up on the bed, not by choice, but because he told her she deserved the warmest spot. Still, she didn't sleep. Her hands trembled under the blanket, her mind trapped in memories darker than the night around her. She didn't understand this human. Why wasn't he angry? Why? Wasn't he cruel? Why didn't he take what the others had always taken? Sale waited for the moment when the mask would fall, because kindness never came without cost. Not in chains by morning, her body was stiff from fear, not rest. She moved quietly and found the tools she'd dropped the night before. She held it again, not to harm anyone, just herself. The only freedom she had ever known was death, but this time the tool felt heavier. His voice still echoed in her head. If you end your life now, they win again. Why did that matter to her? Mason stirred from the floor, eyes opening slowly. He saw her with the sharp piece again, but he didn't shout. He just sat up and said, "You don't have to do this, Sale. Not anymore." She turned to him, her voice hoarse. "I don't belong anywhere. I'm used, broken, and not even my people want me back." She raised the blade toward her neck, her hand shaking, but Mason stood calmly, walking toward her with steady steps. "Then stay here," he said softly. "No chains, no orders, no pain, just rest." He reached out his hand again, open and patient. "Let me take that from you. Not as your master, but as someone who sees you." She stared at him like he was from another universe. Tears welled up again, but this time she handed him the blade and collapsed on the floor, not from pain, but from relief. Mason caught her gently and carried her to the bed again. "You're safe now," he whispered, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders. "You don't have to believe me yet, but give it time." Hours passed, and she finally slept. Real sleep. The kind that doesn't come with nightmares chasing every breath. When she woke up, he had left food beside her, still warm, and a small cloth for cleaning herself. No words, no demands, no watching eyes, just space and time. She sat at the table. While he fixed something near the wall, using old tools and humming a tune, Sale studied him, trying to find the trick, the trap. But all she saw was a man with tired eyes and honest hands. "Why didn't you chain me again?" she asked suddenly. Mason looked up and shrugged. "Because you're not an animal. You don't deserve chains, Sale." She blinked, confused. "But I was given to you." He set the tool down and faced her properly. "You were never a thing," he said. "They just treated you like one. To me, you're someone who needs help, not ownership." Those words dug into her like a blade, but a clean one, a healing cut. They hurt because they were new. And truth always stung the first time. "I don't know how to be free," she whispered. Mason nodded. "Then let's figure it out, together." He handed her a cup of warm broth, and for the first time in cycles, she took something without fear. She drank slowly, letting the heat calm her shaking hands. It was just soup, but it felt like the first kind gesture she'd tasted in years. That night, she didn't curl up in the corner. She sat on the bed while Mason worked by a small lamp. His eyes were focused, but his presence was calming. No judgment, no pressure. She wanted to ask him about Earth, about his people, about how a human could be so different from the others she had heard about. But her voice didn't work yet, not for questions that deep. So she just watched him quietly, and something strange happened inside her chest, a soft warmth. Unfamiliar, but not unwelcome. Later, Mason placed a small object in front of her. It was a simple bracelet made from scraps, nothing beautiful, but carefully woven. "I made this for you," he said. "It's not a collar, not a chain, just..." A start Sale stared at it, then slowly picked it up. She held it like it was made of crystal, too fragile to wear. Then she looked at him and asked, "Why do you care?" Mason leaned back against the wall and smiled tiredly. "Because I know what it feels like to be treated like you're worth nothing," he said. I won't let that happen to anyone, not if I can help it. She nodded slowly, her fingers tightening around the bracelet. Maybe she wasn't ready to trust him fully. But for the first time, she didn't feel like property. For the first time, she felt human. And in that tiny room, with no guards, no chains, and no orders, Sail took her first quiet breath as something she never thought she'd be again, a person. The days passed slowly, like sunlight pushing through a thick fog. Sail had stopped hiding the sharp tools. She had stopped flinching every time Mason stepped near, but she still didn't smile. Not yet. She sat on the edge of the bed, watching. Mason cleaned his weapon, not because she feared him now, but because it was something to focus on. Something not inside her head. Mason glanced at her and asked gently, "Do you want to talk today?" She looked away, then nodded once barely. "I don't know how to talk like you," she said, her voice soft. "I know a little human tongue, but not enough." "That's okay," Mason replied, setting the rifle down. "We'll start." Small, he held up a ration bar. "This is food," he said, then pointed to her. "And you." "Your Sail," her lips twitched. Almost like she wanted to smile, but the habit of fear pulled it back. "You remember my name?" she whispered. "Surprised, of course I do," Mason said. "It's the first thing you ever gave me." That sentence broke something in her, because no one had ever called her name a gift. For years, her name had been erased, replaced with numbers, commands, pain. She had stopped saying it herself, afraid it might vanish forever, but now this human, this strange, dental man held it like treasure. "You can call me Mason," he said with a nod. She repeated it softly. Mason. It felt like tasting sunlight. They sat together in silence. But this time, it wasn't uncomfortable. It was like two storm survivors sitting under the same roof, listening to rain, different languages, same ache. That night, she finally touched the bracelet he made. It had no chains, no locks, just knots. And bits of metal shaped like stars. She slipped it on her wrist and stared at it for a long time, then walked to where Mason was resting on the floor. "I wore it," she said, holding up her hand. He looked at it and smiled softly. "It suits." "You," her voice shook. "Is it true? That humans can choose their mate?" Mason sat up, surprised by the question. "Yeah," he said. "We choose who we love freely." She looked at her wrist again, then whispered, "I never had a choice in anything I was born into." Chains. Mason's voice was quiet but strong. "That's over now." She sat beside him, not too close, but no longer afraid. "Can I ask you something?" she said slowly. "Anything," he replied. "Why didn't you touch me when they gave me to you?" The question hit like a stone thrown into calm water. Mason didn't answer right away because touching someone without their permission is wrong. Finally said, "I don't want anything from you, not your body, not your fear. I just want you to be okay." Tears slid down her cheeks, silent and uninvited, not because he hurt her, but because he didn't. "I don't know who I am without chains." She said, "You'll figure it out," he said gently. "And when you do, I'll still be here the next day." She surprised him while he cooked rations. She stood behind him and said, "Teach me more." He blinked. "More what?" "More human words," she said. "More names." He nodded and held up a spoon. "Spoon?" She repeated it, fumbled it, then laughed softly at her own mistake. Mason turned in surprise. Was that a laugh? She blinked, confused. "I think so," he smiled. It sounded good. Later that evening, Sail reached into her old pouch. She pulled out a small, cracked stone with strange carvings. "This was my family mark," she said. "Before I was taken, Mason studied the symbol with care. You had a home." She nodded, voice shaking. "A forest planet. Far from here. They burned it down." "I'm sorry," Mason whispered. She held the stone close to her chest, then did something that shocked even herself. She handed it to Mason. "Keep it," she said. "You feel safe." Mason didn't know what to say. This woman, beaten by fate, was slowly rising again, not because someone saved her, but because someone simply believed she was worth saving that night. She lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in years, she whispered her own name out loud. Sail. Not as a number, not as property, but as herself. And somewhere in the quiet room, Mason smiled in his sleep. Because even without hearing her say it, he knew she had just taken her first step back toward life. Asterisk, the stars blinked quietly outside the window of the small outpost hut. Sale sat near the heater, tracing the bracelet Mason gave her. The air smelled of metal and warm food. And for the first time in her life, she felt almost safe, almost. But peace never lasts long for those who've been marked. Mason had gone out to check the old Combs Tower nearby. Sale watched the door nervously every few seconds. Even when she felt calm, her body still expected pain. That's how deep fear runs. Then a sound, a low whir of engine sharp, military grade. She rose quickly and moved toward the window. A sleek, dark ship was landing on the far edge of the base. It wasn't one of Mason's kind. And it definitely wasn't friendly. Sale's blood turned cold. Her instincts screamed, "They've found me." She stepped back, chest rising fast, her hands shaking again. Not again, not again. Then footsteps, not Mason's, slow, heavy steps. These were fast, sharp, trained. Voices outside spoke in a language she wished she didn't remember. They said she's still alive. One hissed. "Find the slave," said another. "Bring her back intact this time." Sale grabbed the cracked stone from the table. Her family's mark hand slipped silently toward the emergency hatch Mason had shown her. But before she touched the door, it opened from the outside. Mason rushed in, covered in dust. "Get down," he yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her behind the table. A blaster shot hit the wall right where she had stood seconds ago. "They're bounty hunters," Mason growled. "Probably hired by the same bastards who sold you, guess they didn't like me freeing their property." Sale's heart pounded in her ears. She looked into Mason's eyes. "You could give me back, and they'll leave you alone," he snorted. "That's not going to happen. You're not cargo," he said, gripping his weapon tight. "You're Sale?" Another blast shook. The doorframe, Mason pulled a small device from under the Tabala smoke grenade. He pressed it into Sale's hands. "You know what this is?" She nodded barely. "When I say run, throw it, and get to the vent outside," he said. "I'll cover you." "No," she said, stepping back. "You'll die." "I might," Mason said calmly, "but I'll die doing the right thing." "You are not going back in chains." Tears burned her eyes as she nodded. When the next explosion hit the window, Mason shouted, "Now!" She threw the device. Smoke burst out fast, thick, blinding. Gunfire filled the room. But she was already slipping through the vent, heart pounding like war drums. Outside, snow blew across the ground. She crawled, hidden under the cold white cover, until she reached the forest edge. Behind her, the outpost crackled with chaos and fire. Suddenly silence. No more blasters, no more shouts. She turned, eyes wide, and saw Mason limping toward her, blood on his arm, a burn across his cheek, but alive. She ran to him and caught him before he fell. "You came back," she said, her voice breaking. "I told you," he whispered. "You're not alone." They hid that night in a cave. Using snow to cool his wound, Sale cleaned it carefully, hands steady even as her heart ached. "You got hurt because of me," she said. Mason winced as he smiled. "Worth it." She didn't speak for a moment. Then she reached into her cloak and held out the cracked family stone. She pressed it into his hand and said, "My people used to pass this down to the one we trust the most." Mason blinked. "Are you sure?" She nodded. "I don't know where my home is anymore. But I know what safety feels like now. It feels like you, that night." She stayed close to him, not because she was afraid, but because she didn't want to lose the warmth. She had found not just warmth of fire, but of a bond she never expected. Not as a slave, not as a burden, but as a person who mattered. And in the darkness of that cave, with danger still hunting them beyond the trees, she whispered two words. Mason would never forget. "I choose." The cold outside grew deeper as the snow fell harder, but inside the cave, the fire crackled softly. Pushing back the dark, Mason lay resting. His arm wrapped in cloth, the wound still healing. Beside him, Sail sat quietly, watching the snow drift past the opening like white feathers from the sky. She had never seen snow before, not like this. Her planet had forests and heat, but not this kind of silence, not this kind of stillness, and definitely not this kind of peace. Mason stirred. Groaning slightly from the pain, Sail turned quickly, crouching beside him. Still hurts? She asked, her voice softer than the snow, like being kicked by a starship. Mason muttered with a smile, but I'm breathing, so that's something. She helped him sit up and passed him the broth she had warmed. He took it, their fingers touching for a brief moment. Neither of them pulled away, neither of them wanted to. You're getting good at this, he said, sipping slowly. At what? She asked, raising one brow. At being free, he replied, voice low. You're not the same girl I met in chains. She looked down at her bracelet, the one he had made from scrap. It was worn now, but still strong. I don't know who I'm becoming, she said honestly, but I like her more than who I was. He nodded, eyes gentle. So do I. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Sail reached over and did something unexpected. She placed her hand on his, warm, steady. Real. I used to dream about escaping, she whispered. But I never imagined someone would help me stay free. Mason chuckled softly. Well, you picked the right idiot. She smiled, real smile this time, not hidden, not broken. It lit up her face like dawn after a long dark night. Mason blinked, caught off guard. That was a smile, he said, leaning back. I didn't know you could do that. She looked away, blushing slightly. I didn't know either, she admitted, but it feels good. Later she built a small pile of stones by the fire, just for fun. She balanced them with careful hands, while Mason watched from his blanket. You're full of surprises, he said. Sail shrugged. You think I was just a slave? No, Mason replied. Serious now. I think you were hidden behind fear. And now, I get to meet the real you. She glanced at him, her heart beating faster. There was something new in his eyes, not pity, not duty. Something warmer, deeper, something that made her breath catch. Is this what love feels like? She asked suddenly, the words slipping out without control. Mason didn't laugh or tease. He simply said, it can start like this. With quiet, with kindness, with two people choosing to stay when they don't have to. Sail looked away, eyes shining with something between confusion and hope. I've never chosen before, she said. You're doing fine. He said better than fine that night. She didn't sleep on the far side of the cave. She lay beside him, not touching, just near. Close enough to feel his warmth, close enough to know he wouldn't disappear in the dark, in the middle of the night. Snow covered the world outside like a blanket inside. Two lives that had once been broken began to mend, not with magic, not with sudden passion, but with trust. Quiet and slow like the falling snow, Mason woke briefly and saw her asleep beside him, her hand resting on the stone bracelet, her face calm. He smiled to himself and whispered, You're more than free now, Sail. You're alive. And maybe, just maybe, she was learning what it meant to be loved. *. The snow had started to melt by the time the rescue signal reached a nearby patrol. A small ship landed outside the forest, kicking up dust and frost. Mason stood at the edge of the cave watching it descend. Beside him, Sail stood silent, her hands clenched tightly around the bracelet he gave her. They're from your people, Mason said quietly. Sail nodded, eyes unreadable. I sent the signal a few days ago, he added, in case you wanted to go back. She turned her head sharply. You called them? I did, he said, because you deserve the right to choose where you belong. Her heart twisted. For so long, no one had cared what she wanted. Now he was giving her freedom again, but it hurt more than the chains ever did. The ship door opened, and 3 figures stepped out. 2 guards in gold armor, and 1 tall female. Elegant and cold, her voice rang through the air, sharp as glass. Sail, she called, you've survived. Sail recognized her, an elder from her homeworld, the woman who once watched as the slavers took her away. Now she stood proud like nothing had happened. Sail stepped forward slowly, Mason close behind her. The elder's eyes flicked to Mason, then back to Sail with a sneer. We'll bring you back for reconditioning, she said flatly, to restore your position. I don't want that, Sale replied, her voice firm. You were royalty, the elder snapped. Her gaze slid toward Mason, like poison. Did he touch you? She asked with disgust. Did you forget who you are? I never got the chance to know, Sale said, stepping back slightly. But I'm starting to. The elder raised her hand. You're coming with us. Mason stepped forward, eyes hard. She chooses. You don't speak for her. That's human, the woman hissed. I don't, Mason said, then turned to Sale. But I hope. I gave you the voice to speak for yourself. The wind picked up as silence fell between them. 3 paths lay open her old life. A life of power and control. The unknown future with Mason, uncertain and hard, or the wilderness, alone again. Sale closed her eyes, remembering the feel of chains, the cold stone floors, the silence of her stolen name. Then she opened her eyes and stared straight into the elder's face. I'm not going, she said simply. You lost the right to. Command me the day you watched me taken. The elder's face twisted with rage. You'll regret this, she hissed. Sale turned to Mason, her voice shaking. Will you regret saving me? Never, he said without pause. The ship's guards hesitated, then turned back. The elder climbed aboard without another word, the door slamming shut behind her as the ship lifted into the sky. Sale finally let out a shaky breath. She didn't cry. She didn't run. She just stood there, free in a way she had never felt before. Later that night, they sat beside a new fire, not in a cave, but in a small cabin Mason had found. It was old and falling apart, but it had a roof warmth and space for 2 people learning how to be whole again. Sale placed her cracked family stone on the table, next to it. She placed something new, a small carved figure Mason had made her. A symbol of the life she was choosing, not the one forced on her. I had the chance to go, she whispered, looking into the fire. I know, Mason said, not needing to ask more. She leaned her head gently on his shoulder, and I chose. To stay, Mason looked at her, surprised. You could have had power, position, palace. I want peace, she said. Eyes closed, and I found it with you. The flames danced between them, soft and quiet, and in that moment, Sale knew freedom wasn't just walking away from chains. It was walking toward something better, someone better, and for the first time in her life, her choice was truly hers. The days grew warmer as winter began to fade. The cabin Mason and Sale now shared stood quiet under a rising sun. A thin mist covered the forest, and birds from 2 worlds sang in the trees. Inside, the fire had burned low, but something else had taken its place. Comfort. Not the kind bought with coins or status, but the kind built with trust. Mason stirred from sleep slowly, his arm tucked behind his head. Sale sat at the table nearby, her fingers carving something into a small piece of wood. She glanced at him and smiled gently. You snore, she teased. He grinned, rubbing his eyes. You're just realizing that now? She stood and placed the carved wood beside his bed. It was shaped like a leaf, something from her home world. I used to dream of carving this as a girl, she said, but my hands were always chained. Mason picked it up carefully. It's beautiful. Sale looked at him for a long moment, then whispered, so is this life. He sat up and looked at her seriously. You're not afraid anymore. I still carry it, she replied. But it doesn't control me. Later that morning, Sale walked down to the stream behind their cabin. She washed her hands in the cold water, then paused, staring at her reflection. She saw someone she barely recognized, strong, standing tall, eyes full of light. She touched the bracelet Mason gave her months ago. It still wrapped her wrist. Old and worn but unbroken, she walked back into the cabin and found Mason fixing the roof tiles. Mason, she called, and he looked down. She held something behind her back, hiding it shyly. I was at the market yesterday, she said. Stepping closer, I found something strange. But I liked it. She pulled it out an off-white cloth, stitched in simple patterns. "It's not exactly human, not exactly mine," she said, "but they called it a wedding shawl." Mason's breath caught. "You bought it?" "No," she said, her voice shaking. "I made it." He climbed down the ladder slowly, wiping his hands. She held the shawl against her shoulders and added, "It's not perfect, but I thought maybe it could be like a dress." "Sail," he said, voice low. "Are you saying what I think you're saying?" "I'm not a slave," she said clearly. "I'm not your property. But I would like to be your partner, your family, your wife." Mason stepped forward, emotion rising behind his calm face. "I didn't save you for this," he said softly. "I know," she replied. "That's why it means everything." He took her hands, kissed her forehead, and whispered, "Yes." They married the next day, not with a ceremony, but with a promise by the river. Under the tall trees, with only the stars as their witnesses, Sail wore the shawl, and Mason wore his old uniform jacket. They exchanged simple words. No rings. No audience, just truth, just love. As the seasons changed, so did their home. The cabin became a place of warmth and laughter, and one morning, Sail placed his hand gently on her stomach and whispered, "We're not just two anymore, Mason." Blinked, stunned, then laughed out loud. "A baby." "A new start," she said, her eyes glowing with peace, "not born from chains." She added, "But from choice." Years passed, and the forest grew thick and green again. Sail often sat with her child in her lap, telling stories about the stars. She never spoke of slavery, but always spoke of courage and kindness. And one human who never asked for her past, only her future. One evening, Mason sat outside watching the sunset. Sail came out, now older, wiser, still wearing the same bracelet he gave her. She sat beside him, and they watched the sky together. "You remember what they called you back then?" she asked with a smile. "A reward," Mason replied with a small laugh. "And you remember what I said?" She nodded, eyes full of love. "That I'm not a reward." "No," he corrected gently, taking her hand. "You were the best thing the universe ever gave me, and in the quiet of that world, where stars blinked and fireflies danced, a woman once bound in chains lived freely. Not as a slave, not as a symbol, but as a wife, as a mother, as a soul who chose her own story, and this time it ended in peace."